Modern global Hinduism operates as a highly active, socially engaged, and practical religion. Today, spiritual devotion translates directly into worldly action and social service. In the mid-20th century, German Indologist Paul Hacker challenged this active posture. He coined the pejorative label Neo-Vedanta, arguing that this modern form represented a complete rupture from authentic Hindu roots, a corruption shaped by Western influence. Hacker uses 8th century Advaita Vedanta as his baseline. This orthodox school teaches strict non-dualism, the doctrine that only one supreme, formless reality exists, and everything else lacks ultimate reality. Under this classical framework, the physical world is governed by Maya, or illusion. Because the material world is seen as a distraction from the absolute, the doctrine traditionally emphasizes static withdrawal and ascetic renunciation over social activism. Hacker's logic is rigid. Since classical Advaita denies the world, the social activist framework of modern Hinduism cannot be indigenous. He concludes it must be a foreign, Western import. This narrative assumes Indian philosophy ceased to evolve after the 8th century. It ignores a millennium of indigenous intellectual history and the ability of Indian thinkers to adapt their own theological frameworks. The historical record suggests a different path. Modern Hinduism is the result of a centuries-old indigenous continuum that scholars call Greater Advaita. Greater Advaita identifies a broad, fluid pool of philosophical development that occurred during the Indian medieval period. Dismissing this evolution as neo reduces a dynamic global religion to a byproduct of British colonialism. To understand the actual transition, we have to look at how medieval thinkers solved the problem of action within a non-dualist system. Greater Advaita identifies a broad, fluid pool of philosophical development that occurred during the Indian medieval period. Between the 12th and 16th centuries, Indian intellectuals drove a specific era of internal unification. They utilized a technique called doxography, the intentional process of treating diverse, competing philosophical teachings as a single hierarchical system. Medieval thinkers engineered these hierarchies to place Advaita Vedanta at the absolute apex, effectively absorbing other regional and sectarian schools beneath it. This architecture allowed orthodox monism to coexist with worldly texts and rituals without compromising its supreme status. This medieval solution of synthesis provides empirical proof that Hinduism was evolving natively long before the 19th century colonial encounter. Even with a unified hierarchy, philosophers faced a challenge. How do you build a worldly movement on a philosophy that labels the world an illusion? Medieval tantric Shaivism and Kashmiri texts like the Panchastavi provided the historical bridge resolving this tension. The Panchastavi functions as a mechanical framework, reconciling the static absolute with the dynamic world. It introduces Sakti, a dynamic, immanent vector of the Godhead that animates the physical realm. Injecting Sakti reconstructed the system's mechanics. The physical world was no longer a mere illusion, but the active, intentional play of the divine. The Panchastavi outlines a five-fold model of divine activity. The cycle begins with creation, followed by preservation. Next are dissolution and concealment, the temporary illusion of a limited self. The final node is revelation, realizing unity with the absolute, completing the cosmic circuit. This internal logic proves that Greater Advaita had engineered its own framework for worldly action centuries before Western contact. By the 19th century, the East India Company established a new era of dominance over the Indian subcontinent. Company policies caused widespread disruption, specifically targeting and dismantling the decentralized indigenous education systems that had sustained Hindu philosophy for generations. Christian missionaries added to this pressure, aggressively attacking Hindu rituals and polytheism as irrational. In response, Ram Mohan Roy formed the Brahmo Samaj, creating the first organized intellectual defense against colonial ideological pressure. The Brahmo Samaj adopted the structural aesthetics of Western Unitarianism, including strict monotheism and rationalist discourse, to protect the core of the tradition. This adaptation updated the public interface of the religion, changing how it presented itself to a global colonial audience. While the outward interface shifted to survive, the mechanical engine remained rooted in the indigenous Greater Advaita framework. Swami Vivekananda perfected this synthesis and exported it to a global audience. Vivekananda's theology grew directly from his guru, Ramakrishna, grounding his work in indigenous practice. Ramakrishna emphasized Shiva Jnane Jiver Seva, the spiritual practice of serving human beings as manifestations of God. This powerful doctrine applied the tantric concept of immanent Sakti, the energy of God alive within the world, directly to social service. To communicate these esoteric concepts to 19th century Westerners, Vivekananda needed a new vocabulary. He utilized the frameworks of theosophy and Darwinian biology as a strategic translation layer. Vivekananda mapped indigenous concepts like prana and kundalini onto the Western concepts of involution and evolution. By adopting a Western vocabulary for indigenous concepts, Vivekananda successfully smuggled the ancient tantric engine into the modern global consciousness. In the 20th century, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan codified this synthesis for modern academia and the Indian state. Radhakrishnan presented this multi-layered development as the singular, universal view of Hinduism. Global Hinduism is built from three inputs. 1. The absolute baseline of classical Advaita. 2. Dynamic worldly frameworks from medieval tantric texts like the Panchastavi. 3. The structural vocabulary of 19th century Western esotericism. These converge into the final operational reality of modern Hinduism. Paul Hacker's rupture thesis focuses only on the third pipeline. By ignoring the medieval synthesis, the theory remains historically incomplete. The Neo in Neo-Vedanta does not stand for Western invention. It marks the modern articulation of an ancient, ongoing process. The mechanical engine required to reconcile the absolute with an active world was constructed by Indian philosophers long before colonialism. Measured, conclusive. Modern global Hinduism is not a colonial artifact, but an unbroken continuum, proving the tradition's immense capacity for indigenous survival and integration.